So I think we start the session. Welcome everybody to this year's last CASP lecture titled Governing in the Semi-Shadow of the Global West, the case of Moroccan zawāyā. We're really looking forward to this last CASP lecture, as I think it really resonates with what the philosophy of CASP also is, and foreshadowing also about our future activities. Hello also to my colleagues, Adila Koderbooks, who is co-founder of CASP, and Medical Yosef, who is also associate of CASP. They're also here today, and everybody else, I'd like to welcome you to this session. So before we start with the presentation of our guests today, I'd like to make a brief introduction of CASP for those people who haven't heard about it yet. So I'd like to present you CASP, also a bit its birth and history. We, of course, still a really new organization. CASP stands for Center for African Smart Public Value Governance. We call it, in the meantime, a bit a lockdown idea, because we were founded in late 2020 when we together, Adila Koderbooks and Amar Siam, who can't be here today, from Middlesex University Mauritius, and myself, Emondine Fohim, from the University of Bern, we were reflecting together and thinking about the role of public organizations, and also realizing how we could do more research, especially in African context, as we all have roots in Mauritius and therefore connections to Africa. So that's when we launched CASP in September 2020 and started throughout the year 21 our first webinar series, where we wanted to have some insight from different scholars on our core concepts, which is public value governance, understanding the African context, and also smart government. The idea of CASP, what we want to do, on the one hand side, we have a practical aim. We want to contribute to discussions on improving the quality of public governance approaches in Africa, but also a theoretical aim by refining theory development in organization studies, public management from a non-Western perspective. What we found out in these webinars were particularly three sub-themes that we summarized. On the one hand side, saying, yes, smart public value governance, these core concepts that are quite known from Europe, from Australia, North America, they are interesting concepts to tackle grand challenges. They're new approaches to redefine, rethink how public administration works. But we also discovered that certain particularities that are specific to the African context can impact whether smart public governance can succeed there or not. And the third insight we gained was to say, we think there's a need to listen attentively better to African context to understand how smart public governance can succeed in those different, of course, very diverse contexts as Africa as a content is. So we also wrote a research agenda about it, a small essay about it, where we try to summarize this insight, and then also foreshadowing what shall we do in the future, how research regarding public administration in African context should succeed. And the core insight or a core message we want to provide there is exactly saying, well, I think we need to better understand how public value is really constructed in African context, in different African contexts, and how we can generalize this and introduce into the public management debate beyond Africa, and maybe be also very insightful for other contexts. So on this basis, we decided to launch this CASP lecture series of these years, and we had three different inputs, starting with Doreen van Noren, who talked about an African Ubuntu approach to understand sustainable development goals, and reinterpreted the UN Sustainable Development Goals from this new approach. We had Toussaint Notias, who talked about the particularities when thinking of facial recognition technologies in Africa, what need to be considered, and also a bit more on an international relational approach. Dr. Luam talked about norms of solidarity and regionalism in South African context. They're also about how certain ideologies can help to launch solidarity and regionalism. Today, I say the last lecture, CASP lecture, really looking forward, Dr. Salah Chafik and Professor Wolfgang Drechsler, who are going to talk about the context of Morocco, of zawāyā. And as we're going to hear about it, it's a really good example to understand what are then indigenous approaches to provide public value, to make public value. I'd like to give a short introduction of the two speakers. So Salah Chafik, he's a research fellow at the University College of London at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, studying exactly public value creation from a non-Western perspective, particularly rooted in Islamic traditions, as we're going to hear today. They have also, both of them, currently working on a major research project on management Islamic public value projects funded by the John Templeton Foundation. And Wolfgang Drechsler, I don't really know to start. I found so many affiliations. So definitely, of course, he's professor for governance at the Italian University of Technology, honorary professor at University College London, associate at Harvard University's Davies Center. And I saw really connections that you have, Wolfgang, throughout all over the world, in Germany, Belgium, China, Malaysia. So it's really interesting. Also, Wolfgang Drechsler working on non-Western public management approaches, Islamic perspectives, but also Buddhist or Confucian approaches, generally interested in public management reforms and political philosophy, just to mention a few research activities. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation, and I'm gladly passing on to you. So I share my screens that you can start with your presentation. Thank you very much. Does it work? Any help that you? Yeah, perfect.
And here we go. So I think I would be ready now. I hope everybody can understand me. Friends and colleagues, thank you very much for the invitation and for the chance to introduce both this case study and overall our research avenue. Yes, there are all these multiple affiliations, as is typical today, but actually this project more or less goes out of University College London, IAPP, which is a place for the study of public value in a rather well-known way. So we have split our presentation in such a way that I will start, just as the article does, with a bit of the theory of non-Western PA and what we are actually doing, and then the case study itself will be presented by Salah, and we're both ready to answer the various questions. This paper in PAR that we are talking about really fits the context well. And even if our approach isn't geographical, but it's about the Islamic paradigm, it so happens to be not only the first single country case study in PAR or in any of the top 3 PA journals, if we want to get this discussion into the mainstream, but also the first single country African case study. So it has smashed the glass ceiling, if you will, if we can put it like this. And it is interesting from that perspective alone, I think. Now, about 15 to 20 years ago, a certain classic paradigm shift happened in public administration that we realized that we were thinking of best practices of public management, of public administration globally, just like laws of physics or something like that, and then discovered or rediscovered again, slowly even in the mainstream and gaining ground, that what we think of as global PA isn't global PA, but it's actually Western PA, and it's not even Western PA, but it's Anglo-American PA, and it's not even Anglo-American PA, but usually American PA. The problem with that is that while the United States do dominate the research field, the methodology, and the publications, American public administration would be called even good, let alone very good, by only very few people, and not even by the Americans themselves. Now, if this is the case, and if you want to make the case that what we think of as global is actually Western or even peculiar Western, you need to think what kind of alternative paradigms there can be. And of course, there are a lot of historical ones, or ones that go for more communal, local size approaches, but are there paradigms today that have a large-scale claim, a large-scale potential, centuries of theoretical reflections, and particular areas in which they work well even today? And then you come up with 2 or 2.5 alternatives or competitors to the Western system. One of them is the Chinese or Confucian paradigm, all these countries, 7 to 9. Then we have the Western ones, that's obviously the Berlaymont, and then you have the Islamic one. And the half one that I mentioned is, oh yeah, and here is what it is really, that means American PA. But the half one is the aforementioned Buddhist PA, in which we don't find distinct institutional alternatives today, but which, as far as the goals of policy is concerned, are particularly interesting and particularly easy to swallow for mainstream Westerners. Now, what was the reason that this opening occurred? That a lot of people, especially at the top of the pyramid in PA, said that, yes, there may be alternatives. There is no logical path you have to follow. A couple of things got together. The global financial crisis of 2008 was really important in that it showed the clay feet of the Western system that always came with an economic promise. Then, of course, the catastrophic results of the liberal or former liberal democracies of the West. Especially in Asia, this has really taken the gilding of the cup. And the longer this goes, and in the more countries this goes, it has devalidated a lot of that model. And then in our own area of public administration, public management, that turned that the last large-scale, non-context-specific reform paradigm, and the older ones of you may remember it, especially in Switzerland, the so-called new public management. When that disappeared, there was no successor paradigm. So once you don't have a one-size-fits-all solution to sell to the global south, you do need to talk about context. And once you talk about context, you talk about relativity. So today, the optimal PA is, and now look at this beautiful animation or a mini movie, a moving target. Good PA is a moving target, and therefore the opportunity to consider this more. But what gave it an extra push in the last 3 years was, of course, the big criticism and self-criticism of Western paradigms and Western scholarship in general, both the Black Lives Matter movement, starting in the US, going to England, and then spreading out, but the decolonization one as well. These two are not the same, and it is very important to look at this because that also concerns method and not only, if you will, political attitude, but that made a real big difference as far as the behavior of the PA community is concerned. Salah and I would say that that a paper like ours would be accepted in PAR was absolutely unthinkable, let's say 5-6 years ago. That would have been desktop rejected. That was, you know, weird African stuff for a PAR with no, you know, mainstream quantification or something like that. That would have been impossible. But there is a window now to talk about that, and that, of course, is really important. This leaves us with a tension that you always get in. That means that you have to give up certain global Western liberal values if you go into a privileging of the local decisions, the local ways and the local paradigms. That is a never-ending struggle and a matter for a very interesting discussion from the beginning on, of course, as far as the relativity or overall roof of values is concerned. But in this context is where one operates, and actually our research contributes quite nicely to it. So the question is, do I arrive at good PA more easily if I acknowledge that there are other than standard Western solutions? And are these paradigms that I mentioned part of that? Gerd Buchert has said that good PA, and this is a very simple but a very nice shortcut way to talk about it, is actually the combination of equity and performance. That means you need to actually deliver, but you need to deliver in an ethical way, ethics being informed by the ethics idea of the community we're talking about. Yeah? And the idea would be we get this better if we do that with a focus on other paradigms and other indigenous things. The reason for that partially is that if there is not one way to the optimal and best PA, but several ones, then if I take the standard Western view that I mistake for the global one, then in many places I might actually offer solutions that work in Boise, Idaho, although they probably don't work in Boise, but certainly not in areas from a very different context. And it's a simple matter to look at whether this is the case. So rather than saying there are totally different PAs, there are overlapping ways to good PA, and all of this can be good. Yeah, and of course, the example we've chosen here, there is a nucleus of PA ideas that everybody shares. By the way, they're mostly in public finance. Then there is another core area in which you basically have the same, but you just need to adopt and adapt a little bit. And then you have rather large areas in which things work only in a certain system, but not in another. And talking about project logic, if you show this slide, to which a lot of senior PA people agree, if they see that, they say, okay, we need to do a Euro project about A, about what everybody shares. Whereas from a non-Western perspective, A is the most boring. Because if all agree on that, that's not particularly special. What is interesting is C, because what that means is that there are solutions that work in certain areas, but not in another. And to carry over from C Western to one of the others will lead to worse results. Of course, one needs to acknowledge that all PA systems today are Western hybrid. That means you don't find pure examples. We are talking just about additional variables. Now, of these, what we will talk about today, because that is what frames the zawāyā, and what is the topic of our big research project on Islamic public value, as the saying goes, is Islam. And Islam and Islamic countries are particularly interesting from a Western perspective because the core Western countries do not share borders with Confucian or Buddhist countries at all. That's something people haven't maybe thought about, but Islam is the classic other. It is the other to the European, to the Western world, and it still is so. There is 4 majority Islamic countries in Europe, as you know, and this has been always a high tension area as far as the discussion is concerned. And so it was particularly interesting to look at that from that perspective. And there are a couple of things that have been studied as far as Islamic PA is concerned. And not only we have been doing it, but there is quite a serious stream of publications topicalizing that. Very important has been the chapter in the PA Legacies book by Guy Peters, because of Guy Peters' standing in the field. If he says this is and that is and that is, that means a lot of followers. But even there has been a recent debate of whether you can find a pattern of Islamic PA as far as institutions is concerned, both historically and presently, or whether you have to say it is so other that the entire concept is completely different. We tend to go with the first part, that means with the possibility of empirical verification, and that has been actually part of our study. What you see here is a typical explanation point, for instance, in Islamic PA. No other of the great civilizations spread so fast. What that meant is that because of that, you needed, from an Islamic governance perspective, to make the decisions and do the PA via local elites, whom you needed to tie to your administration. The problem with that is that we then get a principal agent problem, and what we got in the Islamic world is a thorough, more softer idea that you say, if you can halfway deliver, that's better than nothing at all. If you can pay half of the asked taxes, that's still better than nothing. Whereas the Western concept is administration like a clockwork. Now you could say this is a weaker version of PA, but also if we look at human reality, it's a stronger one because it's more realistic. In a way, it foreshadows Mary Grindel's idea of good enough governance, which of course is supposed in the development field, something that pushes you forward rather than holds you back. So, but while it is very clear for people who deal with the history of PA, and that's not a very fashionable field, as you might know, most PA curricula do not even include a history class, that there were times in which Islamic PA was extremely competitive, extremely well working, including the Ottoman Empire, for instance, but certainly Moorish Spain, which is illustrated here. The question, if you want to sell, if you will, or establish, to put it more friendly, Islamic PA as a valid competing paradigm to global Western PA, is that you need to come up with working contemporary institutions that improves the lives of people of the community we're talking about in a distinctive manner, in that PA contributing to public value, as we would put it. And that is the task. So to write something to say that, Seville in the year 1100 was really well administered is nice, but it doesn't get us somewhere. And the task is to put this conversation not in regional or special discourses, but in the mainstream PA discourse, because that would be able to both contribute to self-reflection and to the appreciation, the careful listen, the possibility of the careful listening that was mentioned for your project before in the other. And this is exactly which we started with the zawāyā project, which now Salah will share with you. And he will share his slides, so I will stop sharing mine.
Okay, can everyone see my slides okay? Great. So yes, to transition now into public value, one way of thinking about this is in Al-Farabian, or he built off of the work of Aristotle, so we can say Aristotelian terms, is living and doing good. So the way that in this paper and our larger approach, we can explore public value is through this concept. And more specifically, we look at institutions, right? That's the unit of analysis. We're also looking at indigenous, traditional or local, in other words, and specifically within the Islamic paradigm. So this is just kind of our starting point, if you will, when we looked at zawāyā and subsequent institutions. So for zawāyā, the first image that might come into some's head is kind of a really ornate, where every piece of tile is handcrafted and all of this. And that's certainly, we see empty zawāyā that are sort of like museums in big urban places in Morocco. So that's certainly part of the legacy, if you will. But there's also a side of zawāyā that are very informal and very lived, let's say, that are not museums at all. And this is usually the case in rural Morocco today. Like wherever you go in rural parts, municipalities, etc., zawāyā are very much part and parcel of local life, and what we argue, as you'll hear shortly, living and doing good. To briefly look at the background of how zawāyā emerged as institutions, it was back in the 12th century that the first zawāyā appeared. And in the first instance, they actually served as kind of stopover points and places where travelers could spend the night on the way to the pilgrimage to Mecca. Later on, they became associated with certain professions. In other words, it can be thought of as something else. There were also places like a madrasa. So students would go, oftentimes leave their hometown to go stay at a zawāyā and study the Islamic sciences and others. And interestingly, in the this is the early 1900s, the French during the French colonial period, they actually sought out zawāyā members to take for the Moroccan state bureaucracy, because not only were they literate, but they were kind of intimately familiar with the communities and how to kind of get things done. So in that sense, we can even think of them as preparatory academies for state bureaucracies. But more or less, what all zawāyā have in common is that this kind of service and self-purification element of Islam, known as Sufism. And the Arabic word tariqa is kind of the particular pathway of Sufism, right? So each zawāyā is kind of associated with this pathway or tariqa. Today, we can think of zawāyā as actually making up the informal part of the Moroccan PA system. Arguably, the Moroccan system is kind of bifurcated. We have this informal system that realizes soft power, right? In other words, they're by embodying Islam, the Moroccan PA system, right, being a monarchy after all, the monarchy derives its legitimacy from being kind of the bearers of Islam, right, and carrying that out. And so there's an element of informal power where these institutions give recognition to the monarchy as such. There's also the formal, let's say, global Western mainstream side of the Moroccan PA system that will be global facing, right? Very much French speaking, very much concentrated in urban elites. So this is kind of the system in which zawāyā are operating. What's interesting is that apart from his famous Clash of Civilizations argument, Huntington talked about the king's dilemma. And so more or less, what he said was that there's an issue for monarchies in modern times. And that is this balance between centralizing power, right, which will surely bring kind of cohesion, political stability, etc., and the expansion of said power. So in other words, allowing things like elections, various political parties, etc. And when faced with such a challenge, monarchies do one of three things. The first is that there's kind of a full transition into a ceremonial monarchy. We can think of places like the UK or various others. There's a continuation of the centralization of power. We can think of, for example, various Gulf places or Brunei. And then there's this kind of coexistence of the traditional and modern. In other words, trying to take the middle path, if you will, what we call relaxed centralization. And we think that Morocco certainly kind of embodies this third response of trying to do both. As such, there's we can look at zawāyā briefly now, as we did in the paper, through three different domains of kind of service provision. And looked at geographically, at least, we tried to kind of be as representative as we could with Morocco. So you see, we have from the far north or the Rif Mountains, the middle or high Atlas range, and then the anti-Atlas range. So to begin, what we saw across all of the zawāyā was there's this concept known as khidma, which I guess can be translated as a menial task or service for the public good. And so being for the public good, this khidma certainly induces social cohesion or harmony, but it also induces an individual a sense of humility, and also is seen as kind of a form of worship. In other words, participants doing this see themselves as not only being kind of like good neighbors or citizens, etc., but as by serving creation, getting rewarded by the creator, right? An example of this is kind of annual renovation techniques, or I should say, it's kind of this almost a festival-like activity where people get together at least once a year and can kind of redo the vernacular architecture, right? Replastering using Adobe, things like this. And so perhaps to try to indigenize terms and concepts, we can think of public works as kind of a khidma. And this is something that immediately jumped out as kind of interesting and a very much kind of, you know, local Islamic concept. To dive into the specific examples, for infrastructure, this is in the Atlas Mountains. We saw that the zawāyā once again is made of vernacular. As you can see in the picture, it's a combination of stones, adobe bricks, etc. And so the zawāyā saw itself as a place where it would build kind of the solid foundation of both knowledge and character of community members, neighbors, etc. And so this formulated kind of the basis of how they went about their public works, right, and renovations. They saw that these regular communal renovations was a form of polishing and making the buildings kind of last, right? But what's interesting is that it was impossible for them to kind of build an architectural and spiritual foundation for by and for oneself. What's meant by that is that these modern, let's say, or conventional techniques of cement and metal, etc., it's just a one-time thing where you kind of build it and forget about it, right? And so in them refusing this type of architecture, it's not only to preserve the local kind of vernacular, but it's also from this worldview of a built environment, as well as one's soul needs this kind of common, right, revisiting and polishing, etc. The other zawāyā, this is in the Anti-Atlas, along the Atlantic coast, we looked at in the paper, is can be thought of as a madrasa. So there's about 100 students that are in Nizami system, or referring, of course, to Nizam al-Mulk, where the Seljuk ruler, where basically it's a notion where students come and live, they receive a stipend to study, as well as housing and food, etc. And interestingly, this is the only zawāyā in Morocco where upon graduation, students receive a tertiary degree, so the equivalent of a bachelor's in the US, for example. It's the syllabus itself is what's known as the Timbuktu syllabus, so they study not only Quran and jurisprudence and theology, but also the classical trivium, so grammar, logic, rhetoric, as well as astronomy and other things. And the pedagogy there is very much akin to kind of mentorship. So there's kind of this tacit kind of understanding of and learning that goes on with the various senior teachers and sheikh, basically. And there's one-on-one public daily lessons. So in other words, everyone waits their turn, but you can kind of hear and listen in on what other students are studying and learning. And there's also, more infrequently, there's these kind of student consultations that occur not only on the basis of what they're studying, but also about various questions. And this is all seen as kind of character building and part of the mentorship. Finally, or actually, this is still for the madrasa. One student was quoted during fieldwork as saying, "We're learning more from kind of what they're saying, the teachers. Sorry, from what they're doing versus what they're saying, right?" And akin to the infrastructure theme, we see that there's this constant and conscious refinement of structure, in this case of one's knowledge and one's character within the Islamic paradigm. So that was also something that kind of stood out as a salient point. As for the last zawāyā, this is in Chefchaouen, or the Blue City. For those of you that might have gone to Morocco, this is a famous kind of tourist spot. But yeah, nestled within the old city there is this zawāyā that focuses a lot on money and food for the marginalized and needy. And so there's regular Quran and poetry recitation there as a form of worship during this kind of, you know, gatherings where food is given and things like this. But also participants and members see it as a form of kind of avoiding unscrupulous behavior. So it's like community building, and also once again seen as like this form of character refinement and worship. There's an emulation of the sheikh, or the leader of the zawāyā, through two-way observation. In other words, the sheikh really gets to know the various members and participants in an individual way, and as such can kind of serve as a guide and support each member accordingly. And this is, I guess, you know, what we might talk about in other instances as really getting to know kind of you know, in terms of co-production and things like this. And I'll get to that point later, but it's really interesting. You have leadership that intimately knows each kind of community member. An example of this, by the way, is dispute resolution. So, for example, people will go to the zawāyā, and although obviously local or municipal courts are available, they'll go to the sheikh and ask for arbitration on, for example, inheritance or something like this, some kind of dispute. And whatever the sheikh ends up coming with as a decision is simply respected, because it's seen as the sheikh is not corruptible, is not going to take, partiality or something like this, and it's not arbitrary in the end. And so this is still a practice that's done today. The sheikh of this last zawāyā in Chefchaouen, he actually, I think, aptly summarized zawāyā and their various forms of kind of alternative service provision by saying it's one working with one. And so one way to understand this is kind of the social harmony component we've been talking about, and creating and shaping public value, right? But in the Arabic, there's kind of this double entendre where it's the one working with one. In other words, kind of the creator working with each individual there, and kind of carrying forth this notion of self-purification, character refinement, etc. And so yeah, that was I think a nice apt summary. What we could take away from this in terms of larger policy, in terms of public administration as a field, which Wolfgang introduced earlier, as well as just understanding notions of public value, right? Number one, we see institutions here, indigenous ones, that are able to coexist with the state, and in fact, kind of reinforce the central state, right? We talked about this notion of relaxed centralization. By being granted this autonomy, in the end, this institution is not kind of antagonistic, but quite the opposite. The second is co-production as a means of service provision. So as I was saying, zawāyā leadership and members, they're very much kind of working intimately at this local grassroots level, and this is really interesting, and something that's attempted to be replicated in a lot of various initiatives, smart cities, things like this. But we see a centuries old kind of indigenous model here, and that's certainly something that's which is the third point worth recognizing, right? I think overall, such institutions, they're certainly, as was mentioned, we were fortunate enough to kind of come in at a window where there is a renewed kind of interest in this, and I think writ large, such institutions, instead of kind of starting to reinvent or this NGO model, there needs to kind of be a recognition of what's there, and perhaps taking up and support on their own terms. Which, finally, to conclude, we've been fortunate enough to successfully apply for and receive a grant called Islamic Public Value, based at UCL and funded by the Templeton Foundation, where we're able to study institutions like zawāyā in other contexts. And yeah, we're really fortunate and excited to see the results that come out of that.
Thank you very much, Salah and Wolfgang. And that was a lovely positive note. Congratulations on the funds, and we look forward to how it develops, hopefully inviting you further as well to share your findings, if we may offer this invitation already on record. But yeah, thank you very much for this very insightful presentation, and for the insights about a very indigenous setting and how it is contributing to public value creation. And on that note, we would like to invite questions from our audience. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and you can unmute. Otherwise, if you would like to use the chat box as well, I can relay your questions if needed. So any immediate questions? No, I just have somebody unmuted. I'm just checking. Okay, if not, then I would like to ask one question first to Wolfgang. That was a very interesting reminder about how public administration is it developed and its Eurocentric beginnings, and actually it's very American and so on. It's true that even us at CAS, we talk about non-Western settings and so on. But when can we start? And you talk that you mentioned that it's also very much hybrid Western governance that we observe in public administration. But the question is, when can we start talking about post-Western African public governance? If that question makes sense to you.
Well, in theory, I think you can all the time. But the reality of the integrated global world is that there seem to be elements that that are sold as global but are really Western, and there are very, very few signs that these would be receding at any given time. So it's always like the new Confucianism, for instance. There's always a dialogue with the dominating Western thinks that there are. The step that is now important is to have the non-Western approach as an independent variable. That means the acknowledgement that there is such a thing, that you need to understand, and that you also need to use and own in order to solve the problems at hand. I mean, we have a couple of PA institutions that basically only work in the suburbs of Copenhagen. And that's just not enough, you know. So this is always the question: how much can you improve? But of course, on the cognitive level, the thought about possibilities to go more radical is always there, and is a very fruitful thing to do for the public administration exercise. When I started doing this thing at Harvard, by many of the people who were doing these regions, there was a queasiness, but there's always a queasiness with this topic, but a good queasiness of using the word non-Western, because non-Western, of course, means the West is the center. But the reality is that in almost all countries, there is a demand to play the Western game, to have Western institutions, and also for us PA scholars to think in ways, use methodologies, publish in journals that even more radically than the reality privilege the Western core. And so in that sense, while from a normative perspective, this non-Western phrase is a problem, from a realist, descriptive one, I think it is not only fair now, but also, I'm afraid, in the times to come. The one area in which I do see places in which there is more non-Western than not is in some of the Confucian contexts, because they are just doing so incredibly well in so many cases that this kind of emphasis is possible. But still, even there would be the West as a foil always, and so a certain legitimacy to talk about non-Western.
Thank you. And Laurent, your hand is raised. Feel free to unmute.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's, yeah, for me, it's really, really interesting. I didn't know the paper, so I just discovered it was already published. I thought it was a future publication. And just to introduce myself very briefly, I'm French, half Chinese, but based in Morocco. I'm based in Rabat. And I would love to know more about actually your projects that I completely ignore. And the fact that you have a Moroccan case made it really, really interesting. And I was thinking, do you continue on doing some research on Moroccan, let's say, setting, or are you going on Algeria or Egypt, or I don't know, even maybe Middle East settings? Yeah, just to know more about where you are, where you go. And yeah, and I would be glad if you can get connected over the next months. Maybe some stuff could be done with Morocco, hopefully.
The Morocco part is obviously a Salah question, But as far as the project survey is concerned, you see on the slide that still hasn't been disappearing, the web address, and it documents it rather well. We do try in the empirical case study to do all 5 areas of Islam. So it's not only MENA region, but also, you know, most Muslims live in Indonesia. And so they're in Bangladesh, of course, Central Asia, and so on. So we try, even the diaspora, we try to cover everything, but seeing the basis in Morocco and, of course, Salah's background, the Moroccan, how shall I say, rootedness will always be there. So Salah, do you want to say something about that?
Yes, absolutely. So indeed, I've done now fieldwork for a few months on kind of following up to this piece. And so, yeah, there's I think various research coming out of Morocco, and similar actually what Wolfgang was mentioning too. We tried, unfortunately it didn't work out, but we tried also an Algerian case, but we do have others in the Middle East and beyond. And yeah, we've been fortunate that I think we're starting to get to actually the finish line in terms of some of the cases. But very, very happy still to connect otherwise about Morocco or beyond.
Okay,
Thank
looking
you.
forward. I introduced also Majda Suman, who is connected now, and we are working together on different cases, and including public value and the fact that I know your project, so it's yeah, it's let's connect later. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Good. GASP as a network for connections. So that's
Actually,
great to
let
hear.
me just say one small thing, because that might be interesting here on the project. One of our 4 project areas is actually to create a network of researchers on Islamic public administration, so that there is more of a discourse, because right now this is very individual. And sometimes there are connections between the various researchers, but this is a lot of lone wolves who do this actually. And so one of our purposes is to get the people together and talk and have maybe a platform or something like that. So precisely what you are mentioning, Adila, is actually one of our purposes, if you will, and legacies of that project, that it goes on when it finishes. Sorry for the interruption.
No, absolutely not. And feel free to acknowledge GASP when when that happens, and yeah, with the role we played in connecting you guys. But yeah, yes, thank you very much for these very good questions. And Clément, your hand is raised. Feel free to unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you all for GAG and Salah for your presentation on PE, your public administration. Frankly, I'm not that much familiar with public administration, but I'm first curious to find out with Salah. Tell me, what method have you used to collect data to find out all those results you are presenting, knowing that there's always issue in data collections, mainly in emerging country in Africa. And so I would like to learn more about methodology. How did you collect data? How did you go to find data for the results you are presenting? That's my first question. And also, like I heard from Wolfgang, who would like to promote Islamic public administrations, knowing that Islamic, they are from different perspectives, different countries, different areas, apart from Africa and Asia, and many places of the world, who are somehow influenced by like here in Morocco, you can see that they are somehow influenced by France or Western European country. What something about different to other Islamic countries like Iraqi or other countries? How this can be possible? And I would like to find out, is it very possible for us to get a kind of purely Islamic public administration, not kind of hybrid, because you see that they are somehow mixing some aspect of Western or whatever. There is a possible for us to kind of get a purely Islamic public value, Islamic public administration. These are my two, one question and one observation. I can think both of them are questions. Thank you.
Well, as you noticed, you have introduced the word purely, not us. We wouldn't talk about purely. The question is about an independent variable, not purity. That's why we talked about only hybrid systems existing. And I don't know of a single researcher on Islamic PA who claims there is exclusively Islamic PA anywhere at all. Least of all in Saudi Arabia, by the way, but that's another point. But still, for the research question and the methodology, I will say a few things. But first, Salah, on the real research methodology on this paper.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. This paper, along with the ongoing work, is very much rooted, you could say. So when we're looking at case studies, we're doing so, you can say, qualitatively. And there's kind of an ethnographic approach, right? Polanyian, if you will, just trying to understand institutions as they exist and as they're embedded in social, cultural life, etc. So in terms of data, if you will, collection, that involves kind of informal interviews. Like for any of this, I didn't go with a piece of paper and start asking pre-written questions or things like this, right? There's informal discussions that happen. There's observation and participation in what's going on, right? So there's actually a German-American woman, Susan Kusenbach, where she talked about the go-along method of ethnographic research. So it's kind of rooted in that, and as well as highly influenced, and I'm sure Wolfgang will actually touch on this now, by larger practices in sociology and ethnographic research as such. There's a scholar named Rustam Oranboyev, who's Uzbek, who I think heavily influenced the approach as well.
No, okay, good. Yes, yeah, I wanted to because maybe I have missed something about your case of Moroccan zawāyā. Is the Moroccan zawāyā? Because sometimes you talk about zawāyā, sometimes zawāyā, and I was kind of confused. There are difference between the zawāyā and the zawāyā, and that what exactly does it mean?
I didn't clarify this. It's in the paper, but yeah, a zawāyā is a singular one, and then the plural is zawāyā.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, the one thing I would mention here is, and that is a very interesting debate, almost with a dichotomy at all, that, and that is the question in PA, which during actually a rather recent time has moved towards the privileging of a certain set of formal methods, which came from political science and originally from economics, which got it from the natural sciences, which has actually given up on it by now. The question is how much a certain form of methodology that some PA journals still have and others don't is actually a way of gatekeeping. That means keeping people out rather than getting you closer to any form of congruence with what we can call reality. So if you do this kind of fieldwork and so on, my own philosophical teacher wrote a book, a very influential book with the title Truth and Method, which could also be abbreviated to mean truth or method, one of the two. And our approach has indeed been to take methodologies, which you do need if you do these kind of uncharted things, from areas like sociology, anthropology, and ethnography, because you do need to take solid methodology that is conducive to the actual research that you're doing, rather than from the outside. And while there are journals in PA that would not like this because they are hung up on a very specific kind of their own house methodology, as you can see in this case, that kind of approach with these kind of topics does get through the peer review of the mainstream by now, both for conferences, for books, and for articles. And I think that's a great advantage, because the reification of non-conducive modeling has actually been a disadvantage rather than an advantage to the latter-day PA in which we are.
Thank you. Esther, your turn.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm new to this circle and I found it very interesting. So thank you for the wonderful presentations. I come from a different field, so I'm not so much into public administration. I come from entrepreneurship, but I found many points and insights reasoning with my work in Mali. I have been in rural villages in Mali as part of my PhD back in 2019, collecting data. And what I found very interesting there is that the state or the public administration is not even existing, because the state institutions are so far away and not effective in the rural areas. So something like these zawāyā or indigenous institutions are not even coexisting in this case with state functions in the villages, but are completely replacing the state functions. And I wanted to hear your insights. I think we have a lot to learn from these institutions. And when I was on the field to study entrepreneurial activities, and there was an NGO bringing electricity, I found that the operation of this electricity NGO was almost destructive. And if we don't truly understand the traditional indigenous institutions, Islamic in this case as well, but other types of institution, we completely miss the point. So what can you say about that? What is the difference between rural, urban administration in type of Islamic, and what do we have to learn from this?
Well, you're absolutely right. One of the most fascinating thing, if you study these institutions, well, the first thing is, of course, the question is whether one has to, and that is something where this governing in the shadow from which our title takes off. This is a Guy Peters notion to say that actually there is, we are having a less rigid definition of what the state and the public is than we did have a while ago. And, you know, the states that are on the wiki website when you search, or the ones that are represented in the UN or not, that's not all as that the state is, even if we go back to what the state theory tells us the state is. So there is institutions that perform, and this is important. We are not studying NGOs, but we are studying institutions that perform state-like functions, functions usually given to the state, but that for various reasons the state doesn't want to do, isn't able to do, is on purpose not supplying, and so on. But what you are telling is exactly right. What we definitely do see, it's not all of it. We are having a very rich picture, a mosaic of possibilities. But what you, for instance, saw is that you have, and we see that a lot, is that when the, if you will, nominal state isn't capable to even supply public services, it is a certain kind of very logical Islamic institutions that step in and that do that. And for instance, one of the case studies that we have, Salah mentioned that, Rustam Urenboyev, who is from Uzbekistan but works in Lund and does a lot of research there as well as in the Uzbek diaspora, describes the Mahalla institution in Uzbekistan that actually takes care of local governance. And even if there is an official mayor, this official mayor doesn't matter, but what matters is the Mahalla, which is a government of elders that meets in the front of the mosque and things like that. And for instance, he describes indeed cases where it's the Mahalla that provides electricity to the village, with which I don't want to make a city rural divide, because you have a very wealthy, economically very productive countryside in Uzbekistan as well. And you do find that in urban governance as well. That means that indigenous institutions supply things in cities where the classic government isn't able or willing to do it, to use a non-Islamic system, the water supply by Buddhist cooperatives in Nepal, especially in Kathmandu. So where the drinking water is supplied by Buddhist cooperatives rather than by the state, because the state isn't able to do so. So what I find fascinating is this extreme resilience of such institutions that were suppressed for a while, and then when the state can't deliver anymore here being the point, these institutions being on the upswim again. So there is kind of a reservoir or a legacy that you can use again and make workable. So that's exactly right. And the important thing I think here is to look at these systems, as you said, in the field work. Once I notice this classic idea of a Western European government that takes care of things in a very logical way from the top, and so on, isn't working, then I need to widen, together with so much theory that exists, the concept of state and public, and try to understand where this comes from. Because in the end, everybody wants and needs clean water. So the tendency to get that is large. And if, as I said, this kind of Western state can supply it, somebody probably will. So how does that happen? That, I think, is an interesting question. I should also say that, yes, indeed, what we are doing is PA, and our project is a PA project because that is also our core competence. But many of the findings, many of the theories and so on, you could stretch out to other fields. And indeed, one of the most interesting ones, we are from IAPP in London, Mariana Mazzucato's institute. So innovation and entrepreneurship is a key area of ours. And that is something to which you could understand that. But this is a 3-year project, and we play our cards close to our chest and try to do this for the moment. But absolutely, the interest for the other areas would be very strong there.
Yes, this sounds really promising, and I think we need more in the entrepreneurship field, because there are calls for these non-Western perspectives and so on, even if it's not the best term, and we still miss so much from other disciplines. And yes, so I look forward to hear more of about how the project will develop in the future. I think you can really bring a lot of value.
We certainly will try. Thank you.
Good.
Imamdin, before I take your question, I know Fatih's hand was up earlier and there was a disconnection. Fatih, if you would like to ask your question, please go ahead.
Hello. Especially, I would like to thank the speakers, Dr. Drechsler and also Dr. Chafik. Greetings from Ankara, Turkey. I would like to ask something about the framework Wolfgang mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Also, he divided public administration tradition with 3 Western, Islamic, and Chinese model and Confucians. I would like to say that, ask that, do you think, is it sufficient to explain all the traditions? Also, you mentioned Ottoman Empire, Ottoman tradition. Some kind of Ottoman sultans defined themselves as the king of emperor of Rome, like Fatih Sultan Mehmed. For this reason, do you think is it necessary to explain a bit Turkish Islamic public administration tradition? Maybe I can say that, yes, there's a big Islamic PA tradition, yes, nobody can ignore it. But in this sense, I think we cannot say that Ottoman public administration and Iranian public administration, there is not same. Also, in, how can I say, in Hazar region, many Turkish government tradition, many Turkish public administration traditions comes from there. I have curiosity about Wolfgang's ideas about this. Thank you for your presentation, your admirable presentation. Greetings from Ankara again.
Thank you very much for this question. Of course, how serious we take the Ottoman Empire, you see that although history is not a main emphasis of our project, because as I said, a lot of people do history, we do have an Ottoman history and an Ottoman PA philosophy focus. We even have a PhD student here doing Ottoman PA philosophy. So this is very important. Partially, it is so important if we now look at the Western thing, is that all of the Islamic majority, Muslim majority countries in Europe are actually legacy states of the Ottoman Empire. So the Sicilian and the Andalusian traditions, they have evaporated. So all Islam directly in the heart of the West is actually Ottoman. And once again, this was also something somebody before asked, can we talk about total Islam or definite Islam? The thing is that what we are arguing, what all people that I know who do Islamic PA are arguing, is that this is a very important variable. And the Ottoman tradition is so important because what it came up with, and we can talk about Ottoman PA, which changes over time, of course. Tanzimat administration is other than Hamidism. Hamidism is different than Age of Women administration. Mehmed Fatih and his viziers had a very different way of PA reform. and so on and so on. But within these waves, which you also have in Western tradition, you do have something that you can describe, and that was of extreme importance. So you have an influence of Ottoman PA practices and theory, even to India and even to the maritime Southeast Asia. The Islamic countries in maritime Southeast Asia. So the influence of Ottoman PA on what is today Malaysian PA is very important. So this is really a core way that over time, regionally within the Ottoman Empire and within what is today Turkey, of course, in the Ottoman Empire, the center was somewhere else. Yeah, then it is now, obviously, that has moved towards the east. Is something that you need to differentiate, and that differentiation is important to stay serious, and that's why you need to check it with also historical experts of the Ottoman Empire, so that you can't keep babbling. I mean, Western guys who just look at it from the outside, but the centrality of Ottoman PA in what is discernible there, and which, by the way, the experts in Turkey themselves have called a super Weberian PA, actually. The idea of the divan administration, collective decision-making, the administrative elite, the double administration between porta and palace, and so on, are an extremely important instance of Islamic PA, and one that, to a very significant extent, still lives on today. Yeah, so this is why this is so important to look at, but of course not in the sense of simple cliches of what it was, but in the differentiation that you mentioned.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
And thank you for the question, Fatih. Imam Din, your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, thanks again for the presentation. The way also, as you showed at the beginning, when we look at how knowledge in public administration, or probably in general, has moved. It was established or is established in Europe, in Northern America, and then often it traveled to non-Western contexts. So, for example, new public management, there are a lot of research saying, okay, how can we implement new public management in an African context? And probably it didn't really work. And
Definitely
now
didn't work.
Exactly, yeah. And now we have, this window of opportunity. You come up and the ability to show how public value can create it in a non-Western context, and recognition is one of the contribution of your work. Do you see also possibilities that now this knowledge can travel back? So kind of Western contexts in Europe, in Northern America, can learn from this specific context. You already mentioned something of like co-creation in smart cities. Do you have other examples, or how exactly could look this in practice in a way?
This is a tricky question, but one that in discussion comes very.
Hello?
Okay, I think it's not on our side. That was looking to be a promising answer.
Yeah.
Hopefully Wolfgang joins us very soon. But Salah,
yeah, I could chime in as well. Wolfgang gets back. So yeah, it's interesting. I think that
I don't know what happened.
Oh, you're back. Okay, go ahead, Wolfgang. I'll answer after.
All right. Yeah, I'm not sure what you said, but I definitely know that whatever Salah said was correct. The thing is that, to put it quite honestly, in the environment we are now in this chat room, we are looking for this, but establishing even the legitimacy of anything Islamic, including
I think we might have lost him again.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what's happening here. I'm actually talking from Estonia, which is supposed to be the leading digital country in the world. At least it is the best digital country in promoting its own digitality. So I should have the most solid connection that I do. what I was trying to say when IT so rudely interrupted me is that it's still an uphill battle to establish anything Islamic as valid. So that is the point now, not the learning back, but that in the mainstream discussion, both in policy and advice in international organizations and so on, you don't have the, you know, the pinstriped one size fits all flying in and having your PA reform program, World Bank types dominate, but that you say there is something that we need to look at. That's already a major achievement. And in fact, that is, I'm afraid, particularly so with Islam. So if you go to UNDP meetings or to other countries that talk about what we can learn, the things that I get in non-Western PA in general is Buddhism for all this degrowth and save the planet and green stuff, mindfulness and so on and so on. This is a big stream within PA by now. And then, of course, how can we get some Confucian values? To which I usually say, you can't, because you need to be a Confucian to have those. But for instance, you probably saw it today or yesterday, the new PISA studies came out about education, and the 7 top countries, all of them are either Confucian or have a Confucian legacy. So that must raise some concern in the West, and has. So there is a large literature on that. But to the point that some guy in Essex or in Boston would say, we actually take an organizational form from a Confucian country that works well, say from Singapore, there will be all kinds of excuses why this doesn't happen. So a very interesting question, and it would be very helpful. And I do think that there are people who realize, for instance, that in certain reforms in the Western Balkans, to recognize this actually gets you better result faster. But I do not see yet the borrowing in on a practical level. Salah, would you agree with that?
Yeah, with one exception, and actually this ties back to Esther's latter part of your question, and to answer your question directly, Fahim, I think when it comes to natural resource management, you have a lot of literature now recognizing that indigenous management of the commons, right, has proven to be successful, right, no matter how you try to kind of measure that. And as a result, I think there's tying it to Esther and kind of even entrepreneurship, right? What's really popular now in the West is very trendy, artisanal, local, craft, etc., right? And so I think when it comes to that, and I've written a work on this actually, this self-plug, shameless self-plug, in terms of an apiary, a place where honey is made, that's centuries old, and so they've kind of preserved their ways of managing both the natural environment as well as the craft of beekeeping. And keeping it kind of almost anti-scale. And so I think that's one area where it would be, let's say, much easier or palatable for this to kind of travel elsewhere and to face, you know, the first and foremost challenge, which Wolfgang was mentioning, which is Islamic anything to be acceptable or palatable. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for this very insightful questions from our attendees, and also for their excellent thought-provoking answers as well. And I'll take one final question if there is any from our attendees. Okay. If not, then I believe Imam Din and I, we have a few final slides where we talk about our future events that are taking place at CASP, and hopefully we are going to be extending the network as well in one way or another, and perhaps listening to us one final time may help us remain connected in the future. Imam Din, I believe that we do have a few slides to share, right? Yeah. You're muted. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. So yeah, that's already the end of this year's lecture series. So I found it really insightful. I've learned a lot, and especially also today's presentation that was really helpful. And I think it resonated a lot with what we want to do and what we're doing. And I think what we are planning for next year resonates a lot with has been already discussed. We have heard already the name of Guy Peters today and about hybrid systems working. So the topic of next year's webinar series we're planning is about administrative tradition in African countries. So administrative traditions, Guy Peters, but also other scholars have developed certain criteria in order to define how public administration work in a certain way and come up particularly with 4 main traditions: Anglo-American, Napoleonic, Germanic, and Scandinavian tradition. And what he is also saying is that, of course, some of these traditions left legacies due to the colonial histories in Africa, but of course also in other countries of the world. So what we would like to do, so in that sense, today we looked at the shadow. Next year, we want to look a bit at the object that creates the shadow. We want to understand how do these administrative traditions still exist or not in selected African countries, but also how do they interrelate with local traditions, as we heard today. And the roadmap planned for next year, we have planned 4 webinars next year and the 5th one then in the year after. So we're going to start with a presentation by Guy Peters himself, who's going to introduce the concept and also explaining and seeing how hybrid certain systems are in selected African countries. And then we want to go through 6 countries, which are Botswana, South Africa, Senegal, Cape Verde, Ghana, and Mauritius. So countries who have, based to their colonial history, are supposed to have different influences from these administrative traditions, or the Anglophone or rather Francophone traditions. So scholars from universities of those countries are going to look at them, are going to present them, and also introduce some examples of local traditions. And on this basis, we want to reflect what does it mean when we want to introduce certain institutional change, when we want to introduce certain reform processes, how these local but also introduce Western traditions interrelate and influence this reform path. And we're planning for March then in 2025, having a summary, a comparison where we compare these 6 countries. So the dates are still provisional, and anyway, we keep you informed. Stay tuned on our homepage. There you can see the address casp.org, but also on our LinkedIn page. Feel free to follow it, so then you can easily be kept updated, and also on our X account, former Twitter, as we used to say now. So there's a lot going on still. We hope we keep connected and can keep the discussion with you and all together. Thank you again for being here today, and thank you also again to our speakers for this really insightful presentation and discussion that followed afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions as well from our attendees. Thank you to the presenters. It was a really enjoyable session.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.